Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional and an author from Portland, Oregon, USA, Mr. Norman Wolfe. Norman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Norman is the founder and chief executive officer of Quantum Leaders. He's the creator of the Living Organization Framework. He's an author of a book titled The Living Organization Transforming Business to Create Extraordinary Results. And he's got a new book coming out in the second quarter of 2026, which is titled Leading the Living Organization. So, Norman, before we come to the Living Organization trilogy, a few questions for you. You began your
Sure.
career at HP during a very formative era of the company. What early
Yes.
lessons from HP shaped your understanding of how organizations actually behave?
Let's see. I think the key lessons that I learned uh, came from my struggle with my early days in leadership at HP, my first management job.
Hmm.
I like to say very proudly now, in hindsight, that my first performance review was unacceptable in every category.
Hmm.
And so, and so I had to learn what management and leadership was all about. That was
Mm.
probably a key defining moment in my life. The other thing was that at HP, I managed to always take over roles and responsibilities for organizations that I did not grow up within. Like I wasn't a salesman that became a sales manager.
Yeah.
So I had to really learn how do you get a collective of people to want to produce the outcomes the organization needs.
Hmm.
That really set the tone, even though I didn't know it, but it put me on the path that led me to eventually writing the book, The Living Organization.
Mm.
HP at that time was what I call the iconic
Oh,
HP,
absolutely. Yes.
the HP in its heyday, right?
Mm.
We lived through quite a lot of interesting challenges, like living through a growth period. We were growing like 50% a year. And again, I had to find ways to communicate the HP way, which in most companies, you learn the culture of the organization by osmosis.
Correct.
So one of the key things was how do you learn how to communicate the culture of a company cognitively and still support that embodiment of the culture
Mm.
principles. So there was a lot of key lessons. Of course, I came out and my first job was at Pratt& and Whitney Aircraft, which is very aerospace structure hierarchy. And HP Way was very much management by objective. Obviously, that's one of its things it's known for. And so that also infused me to see the different in how you can lead organizations with different mindsets, if you will.
Correct. Very
All
interesting.
these things became core foundational elements in
Mm.
the way I've evolved and built the living organization framework.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my next question. You've spent over 4 decades with both Fortune 500 firms and high growth startups. What experiences most influenced the creation of the Living Organization Framework?
There was a period of time between 2002 and 2005 that actually was the catalyst that wanted me to write the book. And here's what happened. I had come out of being a chief operating officer for a startup company. I was going back to consulting. I
Hmm.
was already on the board of a public company at the time, and it was a former client, well, it was still a client, but it was a client of mine that invited me onto his board. And I was talking to the CEO, and I asked him, why do you keep hiring me as a consultant? And without hesitation, he said, that's easy. You help me execute faster.
Wow.
That phrase gave
Mm.
me my focus I was looking for as I was going to restart my consulting business. As I began to focus on this whole area of strategy execution, there have been studies upon studies about how poorly companies actually execute strategy.
Mm.
The average, depending on which study you read, I claim the average says we fail about 70% of the time.
Mm.
Also quite, I think the first study was done in the late 80s. I can't remember the guy's name who did it. One of the great strategy academics. Um, and you know that the Gallup report on employee engagement has traditionally been right about 27-30%. So here's the situation I was confronted with. One, we're very bad at executing strategy. Two, employees really aren't very engaged in what the company's doing.
Mm.
The key thing that really made me began to question everything was it's not like we don't know what to do. I mean, you look behind me, you see all the books I read
Yeah.
about management and execution and leadership and employee motivation
Hmm.
and psychology and everything else.
Mm.
And you know we've got all the information we need. So why aren't we implementing it?
Mm.
And what came across my mind was early training at HP, where I went through some workshops where Joel Barker, the guy in the 70s, you might remember,
Hmm.
taught about paradigms.
Yeah.
And it came to mind that the problem wasn't we don't know what to do, we're just stuck in a paradigm. And if you know
Mm.
about paradigms,
Yeah.
they frame the way we see the world.
Mm.
And out of that framing, we make choices about how to proceed to achieve our objectives.
Mm.
And
Very
so I concluded that we're stuck in a paradigm trap. And the paradigm
fascinating.
trap is organizations are machine of productions.
Mm.
And that's why we're seeing the failure rates we're seeing and the disengagement we're seeing.
Very
So I set
interesting.
out to change that and came upon the living organization as a framework.
Amazing. You talk about organizations as entities that think, feel, and mature. How
Yeah.
does this shift in worldview change the way leaders should approach strategy?
Well, so the basic of the living organization is that if an organization is a machine,
Mm.
what is it? And I concluded that, and there's lots of research that supports this, a collective of people who come together to for a common purpose actually begin to operate like a single entity, like a person.
Mhm.
And they operate just like a individual does, but
Right.
collectively. Sort of like starlings. They move in concert with each other, driven by their underlying collective beliefs, what I
Mm.
call context, the rules of the game, you might say, difference between the rules of the game at Pratt& and Whitney to the rules of the game at HP, right? The minute I moved into HP, I began to live the HP way, right? It's
Mm.
just sort of
Yeah.
happens energetically. And so I began to ask the question, if the organization's a person, what does the role of leadership look like?
Mm. Mm.
In the traditional view, we see leaders as plan, organize, lead, and control.
Yeah.
In the living organization view, we say, no, the important thing for leaders to do is set the context. Why are we here? What are
Mm.
we here to accomplish? Develop the people so they can fulfill the needs of the organization to accomplish its purpose. And
Mm.
when I say develop people, I'm not only talking about their capability, but maturity.
Mm.
Right? Because the difference between a person and a machine is people's behaviors are driven by their belief systems. And the more you expand their belief
Yeah.
systems, which is another definition of maturity,
Mm.
right? The
Yeah.
more they can respond to life and be resilient and agile and innovative, as opposed to just being a component part of the machine waiting for somebody to tell them what the plan is.
Mm. Great response.
So,
Many leadership models talk about culture or behavior, but the living organization integrates purpose, relationship, and activities into one system.
yes.
Why is this integration so critical?
Well, just think about it from a point of view of a leader. Here I am, and this is a typical challenge most leaders have.
Mm.
I have so much resources. I can either dedicate it to the hard side of business, right? The things I know that are going to get the results, the process
Mm-hmm.
improvement and inventory management and marketing plans and all the things that get us results. Or I can invest it in the soft side of business. And it's that either or bifurcation that we live in that creates a lot of tension for leaders.
Mm-hmm.
In the living organization framework, we eliminate that bifurcation by recognizing that the achievement of our goals actually can serve as the catalyst
Mm-hmm.
for the development of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And if we develop the collective maturity and capability, we increase the capacity of the organization to execute.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this virtuous cycle that's built into the living organization framework that allows us as leaders to have one framework that integrates all of the different components that make us successful.
Mm. Well said. You speak about leadership maturity.
Yes.
What does a mature leader look like in the context of a living organization?
Well, really no different than a mature individual. What are the attributes of a mature individual? Things like they can connect with other human beings at
Mm-hmm.
more than just the logical, rational level, right? I can have a conversation with you that comes from my heart, and I can listen to you from your heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a leader, I can understand what's really motivating my people. They're
Mm-hmm.
not just components I'm trying to figure out how to manipulate into behaving a certain way
Yeah.
through bonus plans and incentives, but I'm really connecting with you. A mature leader has the ability to accept the world as it shows up
Mm-hmm.
without the need for the world to fit their plan. So when something happens that's not within their predefined preference way of thinking or happening, they can flow with it. They can respond to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
A mature leader doesn't deal in black and white. They deal with ambiguity very comfortably. They understand the value of different points of view. These are some of the attributes of the mature leader
Mm-hmm.
that we talk about.
And would you be able to give me an example?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a bunch of them. Let me pick one. The other day, I was talking with a one of the executives I coach, one of the VPs of an organization, and he was struggling with a uh, peer of his, one of
Mm-hmm.
his equals, one of the other VPs.
Mm-hmm.
And the other VP tends to be what you might call black and white thinking, very tactical in nature. And this VP was being very frustrated by the inability to communicate with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I had him, one of the skills we teach is what we call heart centering, right? So that's the ability to get out of your head and think about something from a more intuitive, felt sense about
Mm-hmm.
the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I had him go into the heart center and see the person from their world view, get into his world.
Mm-hmm.
And as he did that, he said, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I see what the problem is."
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about it, and he was able to then go and communicate with the guy. And for the first time in their interaction, they actually had a useful, productive conversation
Mm-hmm.
because there wasn't this your way versus my way that typically happens in most conflicts. That's
Mm-hmm.
just one example of what happens when you go into you learn these skills of maturing as a leader that we've talked about.
Hmm. Very interesting. Let's now move to your book, Norman. Your
Okay.
book focuses on shaping the three forces behind every outcome: what people do, how they relate, and what they believe. How did you arrive at these three core forces?
Oh gosh. I began to ask the question, how do I, as a person,
Mm-hmm.
create the results I create?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, we have to do something, right? We have to write code. We have to develop a budget or a forecast. We have to do our annual planning, whatever. We have to do stuff.
Yeah.
So, whatever there is, there's what I call the domain of activity, the doing this, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
I also know that if I have a fight with my wife when I go to work in the morning,
Mhm.
I am not as productive
Yeah.
as if I didn't. Now, my wife
Mm.
has nothing to do with business, but that dynamic of the relationship has a huge impact on me.
Correct.
And if it's compounded with conflicts at work or whatever, so this whole notion of the nature and quality of our relationships really has a big impact. And in business, traditionally, leadership language would call it having a synergistic relationship,
Mm.
which is really, if you think about it from an energy point of view, it's like two energy waves. When they're in phase, they amplify.
Yeah.
That's synergy. When they're out of phase, they attenuate.
Mm.
So relationship began to form into the equation. But then my experience has always shown me that what people believe has a huge impact on what they're willing to do, how they do it. There's an old saying that's something like, if you think you can, you're right. If
Mm.
you think you can't, you're
Mm.
right.
Correct.
Right? This notion of what we believe has a tremendous impact on
Mm.
ourselves. And so I began to formulate that and many other aspects to it into this three forces idea, three fields idea
Mm.
of the living organization. We call it activity, relationship, and context. The important thing about that from a CEO's point of view is most of the time we spend our efforts on activity, trying to refine the activity. You might consider it the behavior patterns, which for
Mm.
me, behavior is both the activity and our interaction. So activity and relationship combined equals behaviors.
Mm.
And if you think about, I want to change my outcomes from A to B, and most organizations, individuals have optimized their behaviors to produce the outcomes they're getting, right? We work
Mm.
hard to become very efficient at what we're doing.
Mm.
So I'm now optimized to behave in ways that give me outcome A.
Right.
If I want to get outcome B, I can't do the same behaviors and expect a different outcome. So I got to change
Mm.
the behavior. But
Yeah.
here's the critical element. Behaviors are determined by our context.
Mm.
So if I don't know how to unbundle the underlying context that's driving the behaviors,
Mhm.
for example, to make it concrete, an organization I was working with, a bunch of engineers in a highly secure environment. They used to be a sole source supplier to the government for uh, cryptography algorithms and hardware.
Mhm.
And they were known for how brilliant they were and how elegant their solutions were.
Mm.
But since they were sole source suppliers, they didn't have to care about budgeting.
Right.
So the engineer's mindset was, we're all about making the most elegant solution.
Right.
Now time moves on, and they're now in highly competitive situations. Right?
Mm.
They're no longer sole source supplier, and we're losing. I think the success rate was like 15, 18%.
Mm.
So they brought in a consulting firm to help them with the process, right? Very sophisticated bidding process with black hats and
Mm.
all that stuff. Their success rate went up to 22%, basically
Okay.
no difference.
Mm. Mm.
As I was working with the organization on a whole different project, the CEO asked me to take a look at what was going on. And after talking to the engineers, I said, look, here's your problem. We've got engineers who value being people who develop the most elegant solutions.
Right.
You've got business development people who are coming back and saying, we can't get you more money. You've got to do
Mm.
something, right?
Correct.
And the engineers are resisting it because their belief system as to how they identify themselves
Mm.
was being threatened. So they were at a standstill.
Mm.
What we did was just reframe the context. It was simple, and it wasn't just go in one day and do this, but generally what we did was we reframed the context to any engineer with enough resources can develop elegant solutions.
Mm.
But you say you guys are the best engineers.
Yeah.
Only the best can develop elegant solutions within constrained budgets. So are
Correct.
you really the best? And that little reframing put them now in alignment with the world they were in, and they
Mm,
worked better with business development. About a
mm,
year later, I heard from the CEO, and he said that the success rate went up to 60%.
mm.
That's how significant that change is.
Fascinating. What a great example. Thank you.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
welcome.
Norman, I have time for two more questions for you. What are the early signs that an organization's relational fabric is either supporting or limiting its ability to execute?
What I typically see are things like uh, the silo trap. People are optimizing their own individual unit
Hmm. Hmm.
over the success of the collective.
Yeah.
So, as a friend of mine used to say, they optimize the subunit at the expense of and sub-optimize the whole. So that's one critical sign that I see.
Mm, mm,
Another one I see is an organization where there's way too much dependency on the leader to come up with the solutions. In this complex world we live in, no leader can handle everything. They have to have people who are willing to not only buy into the strategy, but own their contribution to the solution of the
mm,
strategy.
mm,
So those are some of the typical signs I see early on that says they're in the paradigm trap.
mm. Very interesting. How does this framework apply to fast-growing startups where chaos and speed often overshadow clarity and culture?
Well, it depends on how small the startup is.
Yeah.
When it's really in the very, very, very early stages of
Mm,
startup, where everything is chaotic and you want it to be chaotic,
hmm.
you want to allow for that variability. One of the things that happens with startups when they start to come out of that phase is they work very, I mean, if you think about a machine and you want to optimize the machine, so if you're going to use the machine paradigm, you want to eliminate variability
Mm,
because that's the enemy of efficiency. But if you eliminate variability, you're also eliminating innovation because innovation comes out of chaos.
correct.
So you got to be able to find that right balance. And when we do work with startups, we encourage them to maintain that fluidity that is required in that early stages,
Hmm.
but prepare for a way of growing and evolving without losing
Mm,
the that fluid nature while you're implementing structure. We believe that structure, we call it scaffolding, supports purpose,
right.
doesn't drive the organization.
Mm,
So we're constantly looking to adjust scaffolding as the organization goes into the next phase.
mm,
When I was at HP, I'll end with this nice little story. I had just taken over the responsibility for the region admin organization,
hmm.
and it was in trouble. It was a extremely poorly performing organization, and it was highly centralized. So after I did my analysis, I wanted to move to a more decentralized, more fluid, more
Mm,
responsive organization,
mm,
especially to the organizations we supported, sales, service, systems engineering. And I wrote this proposal and gave it to the general manager. And he looked at it and he came in my office and he threw it on my desk. He says, "Yeah, we've done this so many times before, centralized, decentralized, centralized, decentralized.
mm,
Forget it." And he walked out.
mm,
Now, I spent 3 months developing this plan and I was devastated.
mm,
Well, Phil, that was the general manager, came back into my office at the end of the day and he said, "Norman, I got to apologize to you." He says, "I know, and your plan is absolutely brilliant and we're going to implement it." He said, "You just have to understand, I've been around long enough that I've seen us
mm.
go through this
Correct.
pattern of centralized,
Yeah.
decentralized." He said, "But
Mm,
here's what I want you to remember, and this has been a lesson that has stuck with me.
fascinating.
Think of it like a wheel,
Yeah.
right? The wheel goes around centralized, decentralized,
Mm,
centralized,
yeah.
decentralized,
Mm,
right? But as the wheel goes around, the wagon moves forward.
mm,
And that has stuck with me. And it's part of our training. We call it balancing opposites.
mm,
There's a time to be stable, there's time for change, there's time for innovation, there's time for stability, there's time for centralization, time for decentralization.
Mm,
And if you learn how to balance those polarities, those opposites, you keep the wagon moving forward nice and smoothly.
amazing. Amazing. And my last question for you, Norman. If a leader or a CEO wants to begin applying your ideas immediately, what are the first three practical steps they should begin to take?
Well, the first one I would say is begin to challenge the way you view the organization.
Mm,
Think of it not as a person, I mean, as a machine of component parts organized into departments,
yeah,
but think of it as a person, alive and vibrant,
yeah,
who has belief systems and context and
mm,
relationships, as well
correct.
as their activity. Um, the second thing I would say is learn to trust your instincts.
Mm,
And by that, I mean, don't try to make everything logical and rational and
correct.
learn how to go what we call heart-centered wisdom. Learn how to balance the head and the heart.
Mm,
Um, and then the third thing would be the skill of learning how to reframe context, because that's going to be what drives everything else.
mm. Very interesting. And on that note, Norman, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation this has been. I
Well,
mean,
thank you.
you actually given life to an organization, and then your interpretation of the organization and what you said few times, which is reference the context, which is so important in anything that you do in life. And then your very interesting pieces of advice, which is challenge the norm and trust your instincts, were absolutely fascinating and will give a lot of my viewers and listeners time to
Thank you.
think and do some introspection. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Your questions were quite stimulating, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.